Clearwater, a small town with quiet streets and an even quieter truth, its people have lived in the shadow of fear for far too long. For years, Derek Hastings and his crew have ruled the town with intimidation and cruelty, backed by the power and wealth of the Hastings family. Businesses have been destroyed, families driven away, and hope all but extinguished. But everything changes when Mac Dixon, a former Marine seeking a fresh start, arrives. He's a man of few words and steady resolve, hoping to leave the battles of his past behind. Yet, when Mac witnesses the harm caused by Derek's gang, he's drawn into a fight he didn't ask for but can't walk away from. As Mac begins to peel back the layers of corruption that run through Clearwater, he finds unexpected allies: a single mother and her son, a scared young man desperate for redemption, and a town rediscovering its courage. Together, they confront the Hastings family's grip on the community. But will the truth be enough to overcome the power of fear and wealth? Will the town's fragile unity hold against the forces determined to silence them? The small town of Clearwater sat quietly under the wide expanse of a summer sky, its streets lined with weathered buildings and picket fences that spoke of time-worn stability. Marcus Mac Dixon parked his battered pickup truck in front of a modest house on the edge of town, stepping out into the stillness. His boots crunched on the gravel driveway as he took in his new surroundings: a house needing a fresh coat of paint, a yard overgrown with weeds, and a front porch where he hoped to find some semblance of peace. Mac had chosen Clearwater for a fresh start. After 20 years in the Marine Corps, he had grown weary of life's noise. Cities were too chaotic, and the memories of his service weighed heavily in crowded places. This town promised something simpler, a slower rhythm where he could find his footing. He had found the house online, bought it sight unseen, and packed up what little he had to leave behind the city's suffocating pace. The house was modest but serviceable. Inside, the furniture was sparse: a hand-me-down couch, a scratched dining table, and a bed he had yet to assemble. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of his late wife, Cynthia. She smiled warmly in the picture, her eyes holding a spark that seemed to dim the weight of the world. Mac placed the photo on the mantel, her memory a silent companion in this new chapter. By the second day, Mac ventured into town. The streets were quiet, save for a few locals who wandered in and out of the small shops lining Main Street. His first stop was the local diner, a relic of simpler times with its flickering neon sign and the smell of coffee and fried food wafting through the open door. Mac stepped inside, his broad shoulders brushing the doorway as he took a seat near the window. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tired but kind face, approached cautiously. "Coffee?" she asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "Yes, please," Mac replied, his voice steady but low. "And whatever special you have." The waitress nodded and retreated to the kitchen. As Mac waited, he noticed the subtle glances from other patrons. They were not openly hostile, but their lingering gazes held curiosity, judgment even. He understood their reaction. At 6'3", with a frame built by years of military discipline, Mac often drew attention. Coupled with his dark skin, he had come to expect the unease in places like this, where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The bell above the door jingled, and the atmosphere shifted. 3 men entered, their loud laughter cutting through the quiet. One of them, a wiry man with a cocky swagger, caught sight of Mac and smirked. "Well, look at this," the man drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We got ourselves a new face." Mac kept his gaze on his coffee, stirring it slowly. He had learned long ago not to rise to such bait. Silence was often the best way to disarm a fool. "What's the matter, big guy?" another man chimed in, his tone mocking. "Too busy counting calories to say hi?" Their laughter echoed through the diner, but Mac remained calm. The waitress reappeared with his plate, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. "Ignore them," she whispered before hurrying away. The leader of the group leaned against Mac's booth, his grin widening. "You think you can just stroll in here and take up space like you own the place?" Mac looked up then, his dark eyes meeting the man's with quiet intensity. "I'm just here to eat," he said evenly. The leader hesitated, his bravado flickering under Mac's steady gaze. Before he could respond, the waitress appeared again, her voice firmer this time. "Leave him alone, Derek," she said, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "Go sit down." Derek sneered, but backed off, leading his crew to a booth in the corner. Mac continued his meal in silence, though the tension lingered in the air. When he finished and went to pay, the waitress handed him his change along with a slip of paper. Scrawled in neat handwriting were the words, "If you ever need anything, just ask. Sarah." Mac glanced up, surprised. She offered a small, weary smile before turning to another customer. Walking back to his truck, Mac felt an unfamiliar warmth. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. It was a reminder that not everyone in Clearwater was like Derek and his gang. Perhaps this town, with all its flaws, still held room for kindness. As he drove back to his house, Mac thought about the look in Sarah's eyes, exhausted but resolute. He decided then that he would stay, not just for himself, but for people like her. If Clearwater was going to challenge him, he would meet that challenge head-on. The evening settled over the town as Mac sat on his front porch, the photograph of Cynthia resting in his lap. He traced the edges of the frame, her smile anchoring him. "This place might not be perfect," he murmured to the photo, "but it's a start." And with that, he resolved to build something better, not just for himself, but for a community that might one day feel like home. The morning sun poured golden light over Clearwater as Mac rolled out of bed, the air still and quiet. His modest house creaked with the signs of age, but it was sturdy and had potential, much like his new beginning here. As he made coffee, his thoughts drifted back to the diner and the note Sarah had slipped him. It had been years since someone offered him kindness without pretense. In his life, first as a Marine, then as a widower, he had learned to rely on himself. Yet, Sarah's simple gesture lingered in his mind, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, Clearwater wasn't beyond saving. By mid-morning, Mac decided to visit the diner again. The streets were a little livelier now, with shopkeepers unlocking their doors and locals greeting one another with nods and waves. As Mac walked through town, he noticed how the rhythm of life here differed from the relentless pace of the city he'd left behind. People moved slower, deliberate. He could appreciate that. When he entered the diner, the bell above the door jingled, and Sarah looked up from behind the counter, her face lit with a brief smile before she grabbed her notepad and approached him. "Back already?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "Good coffee," Mac replied simply, sliding into the same booth by the window. Sarah chuckled, jotting something down. "What'll it be today?" "Just coffee for now," Mac said, then hesitated. "And thanks for yesterday." The note. Sarah paused, her smile softening. "It's nothing," she said, though her eyes betrayed a deeper gratitude that he had acknowledged it. "I figured you might need a friendly face, what with Derek and his crew acting like fools." Mac's jaw tightened at the mention of Derek, but he kept his voice calm. "They always like that?" Sarah sighed, glancing toward the counter where the cook worked silently in the kitchen. "Worse. Derek thinks this town belongs to him because of his dad. Most folks just put up with it." Mac tilted his head. "Why?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "Fear. Richard Hastings owns most of the businesses in town, and his brother's on the council. If you cross Derek, they'll make your life hell." The revelation settled heavily between them. Mac had suspected there was more to Derek's arrogance, but hearing it confirmed made his resolve harden. "Not everyone's like them, though," Sarah added, as if sensing his thoughts. "Most folks around here are good people. They just don't know how to fight back." Mac nodded slowly. Maybe they just need someone to remind them how. Sarah studied him for a moment before offering a quiet smile. Maybe. The bell above the door jingled again, and a young boy shuffled in, his head down. He couldn't have been older than 12, his skinny frame swallowed by an oversized hoodie. Sarah waved him over with an encouraging nod. "Hey, Kevin," she said warmly. "What can I get you today?" Kevin slid onto a stool at the counter, glancing at Mac briefly before mumbling, "Just a soda." Sarah set a glass in front of him and leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Everything okay?" Kevin shrugged, his gaze fixed on the counter. Mac watched the interaction from his booth, noticing the tension in the boy's posture. It reminded him of the recruits he used to train, young men who carried invisible burdens but refused to show it. After Kevin finished his drink, he stood to leave, but his hands were trembling as he fished in his pocket for money. Mac stood and approached the counter, placing a bill down before Kevin could speak. "On me," Mac said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kevin blinked, startled, before mumbling a quiet, "Thanks," and bolting out the door. Sarah watched the exchange with a faint smile. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Mac replied, returning to his seat. The rest of the day passed quietly, but that evening, as Mac sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, a knock sounded at his door. Opening it, he found Kevin standing there, shuffling his feet and avoiding eye contact. "Can I help you?" Mac asked, his voice steady but kind. Kevin hesitated before blurting out, "I heard you were a Marine." Mac raised an eyebrow but nodded. "That's right." Kevin looked up then, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Do you teach people how to fight?" Mac stepped aside, gesturing for the boy to come in. Kevin hesitated but eventually entered, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for rejection. "What's going on?" Mac asked, sitting across from him. Kevin fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie before answering. "Derek's crew, they've been messing with me. Pushed me down at school, broke my bike. My mom, she says we can't do anything because of his dad." Mac felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, but he kept his expression calm. "And you want to learn how to fight back?" Kevin nodded, his hands balling into fists. Mac leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "I can teach you how to stand up for yourself, but fighting's only one part of it. You have to be smart, too. You sure you're ready for that?" Kevin hesitated, then nodded again, more resolutely this time. "Good," Max said, standing. "We'll start tomorrow after school." Kevin's face lit with a mixture of relief and excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Dixon." "Just Mac," he replied, "and bring your bike. I'll help you fix it." As Kevin left, Mac watched him disappear down the street, his steps a little lighter than before. Mac closed the door, his thoughts racing. This wasn't what he had expected when he came to Clearwater, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was exactly where he needed to be. The sun was just beginning to rise when Mac stepped onto his porch, sipping his coffee and listening to the quiet stirrings of Clearwater. Today felt different. There was a sense of purpose in the air, and for the first time since his arrival, Mac felt like he was beginning to find his place. Kevin showed up that afternoon as promised, his bike in tow. It was a mess, the chain hung loose, the tires were flat, and scratches marred the frame. Mac set up a small workbench in the driveway and motioned for Kevin to join him. "First lesson," Mac said, pulling out a toolbox. "You do not have to be the strongest, but you do need to be resourceful. Let's get this bike fixed." Kevin's face lit up, and the boy eagerly began following Mac's instructions. As they worked, Kevin started to open up. "Derek and his friends have been after me for months," Kevin said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They wait for me after school or show up when I'm with my friends. My mom says to ignore them, but it doesn't stop." Mac paused, tightening a bolt on the bike. "Ignoring bullies only works if they're looking for a reaction. Derek, he's looking for control. That's different." Kevin looked up at him, wide-eyed. "What do I do then?" You stand firm, Mac replied. Sometimes standing up isn't about fighting back. It's about showing them they can't shake you. You'll learn both here. Over the next hour, they repaired Kevin's bike and started a simple training routine in Mac's backyard. Mac taught Kevin how to steady his stance, move with intention, and block basic attacks. The boy was clumsy at first, but his determination reminded Mac of raw recruits he had trained during his time in the Corps. Good, Mac said as Kevin successfully dodged a slow punch. You're catching on quick. Kevin grinned, sweat dripping from his brow. Thanks, Mr. Dixon, Mac. This is way better than gym class. Mac chuckled. We'll keep at it. Now, head home before your mom wonders where you are. Kevin hopped on his newly repaired bike, riding off with an enthusiasm that made Mac smile. As he packed up the training equipment, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of his yard. Nice work, the woman said, stepping closer. She was in her late 30s, with tired eyes but a strong presence. She extended a hand. Linda Johnson, Kevin's mom. He told me you were helping him. Mac shook her hand firmly. Linda, good to meet you. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, glancing toward the street where Kevin had disappeared. It's been hard for him since his dad passed. Derek and his crew only make it worse. I've tried to shield him, but it's not enough. Mac nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. You're doing what you can. Kevin's a good kid. He just needs someone to show him how strong he already is. Linda smiled faintly. That means a lot. Most people here just stay quiet, hoping Derek will leave them alone. They're afraid, Mac said. Understandable, but fear only lets someone like Derek get stronger. Linda hesitated before speaking again. There's a town meeting tomorrow night at the community center. Most of the time it's just routine stuff, but a few of us have been trying to bring up what Derek's doing. If you're free, maybe you could come. Mac considered her invitation. He wasn't looking to become the town's defender, but he could see the cracks in Clearwater's foundation, the unspoken tension, the resigned silence of people like Linda. I'll be there, Mac said. The following evening, Mac arrived at the community center. The gymnasium was small, with rows of folding chairs set up for the meeting. A modest stage at the front held a podium, and a few town officials sat behind it, including a portly man Mac assumed was the mayor. Mac slipped into a chair near the back, watching as residents trickled in. He spotted Linda seated near the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Kevin was beside her, his eyes scanning the room nervously. As the meeting began, the mayor droned on about funding for street repairs and plans for a fall festival. The room was quiet, the atmosphere heavy with the unspoken issues no one dared to address. Finally, Linda stood, raising her hand to speak. Mr. Mayor, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I think we need to talk about something more serious, about the harassment some of us have been dealing with. The room stiffened, a ripple of unease passing through the crowd. What harassment are you referring to, Mrs. Johnson? The mayor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Derek Hastings and his friends, Linda said firmly. They've been targeting families, vandalizing businesses, and making people feel unsafe. It has to stop. A murmur spread through the room, but no one else spoke up. Mac saw heads bowing, eyes averting, as if acknowledging the problem would invite trouble. The mayor cleared his throat. I understand your concerns, Mrs. Johnson, but these are young men. Boys will be boys. And we. Mac stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. The room fell silent as he stepped forward. They're not boys, Mac said, his deep voice carrying across the room. They're grown men using fear to control this town. And from what I've seen, it's been working. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Dixon, I believe you're new here. Perhaps you don't fully understand. I understand plenty, Mac interrupted, his tone sharp but calm. Fear keeps people quiet, and silence lets bullies like Derek thrive. But it doesn't have to be that way. Linda glanced back at Mac, her expression a mixture of gratitude and surprise. Kevin's eyes lit up with admiration. After a long pause, a man in his 40s stood up. "Mac's right," he said, his voice hesitant but gaining strength. "I run the hardware store. Derek's crew hangs out there sometimes, scaring off customers. I thought it was just me, but if others are dealing with this too?" Another voice chimed in, then another, each story adding to the growing momentum. Mac watched as the room came alive with voices that had been silent for too long. The mayor, clearly overwhelmed, tried to regain control. "We'll, look into this matter further," he stammered. "Make sure you do," Mac said, his gaze steady. As the meeting ended, Linda approached Mac with a grateful smile. "I didn't think anyone else would speak up. Thank you." Mac shrugged. People just needed a reason to start. Kevin tugged on Mac's sleeve. "Are we still training tomorrow?" Mac grinned. "Wouldn't miss it." The days after the town meeting marked a quiet but significant shift in Clearwater. Whispers began to circulate about Derek Hastings and his crew, growing louder with each passing day. For the first time, people were starting to believe they could challenge the status quo. The morning after meeting with Eric, Mac sat on his porch, the crisp air carrying the faint sounds of a town awakening. His coffee steamed in his hands as he replayed the conversation with the journalist. Eric had seemed determined to pursue the story, but Mac knew what that meant. He and Clearwater were about to draw the full attention of the Hastings family. It didn't take long. By midday, as Mac was walking to the community center for Kevin's training session, a sleek black SUV pulled up alongside him. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Richard Hastings himself. "Mr. Dixon," Richard said smoothly, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. His tailored suit and confident air spoke volumes about his position in town. "A moment of your time?" Mac stopped, meeting Richard's piercing gaze without flinching. "What do you need?" Richard gestured to the passenger seat. "Get in, let's have a chat." "I'm fine right here," Mac replied, his voice calm but firm. Richard's lips curved into a thin smile. "Suit yourself. Word around town is that you've been asking a lot of questions, stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any." Mac folded his arms. "Trouble? You mean people finally standing up to your son and his crew?" Richard's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "My family has done more for this town than you'll ever understand. What Derek does, while regrettable at times, is hardly your concern." "It's everyone's concern when people live in fear," Mac said, his voice steady. Richard leaned closer, his tone dropping. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away, Mr. Dixon. Leave Clearwater, go back to wherever you came from, and I'll make sure this all blows over." Mac stared at him, unflinching. "You think I scare that easily?" Richard's smile returned, but it was colder now. "No. But I think you'll find it hard to win when the people you're fighting have more money, power, and connections than you can imagine." Mac's expression didn't change. "You're underestimating this town, Richard. People are starting to see through you and your family. That power you're so proud of, it's slipping." Richard's eyes hardened. He straightened in his seat and rolled the window back up. "Have it your way," he said, as the SUV pulled away. Mac watched the vehicle disappear down the road, his resolve only strengthening. Later that day, Mac was back at the community center, helping Kevin refine his punches. The boy's focus had improved, his movements more deliberate. Mac could see the confidence growing in him, and it reminded him why he had chosen to stay in Clearwater. After the session, Kevin left with Linda, but Mac stayed behind to tidy up the gym. As he was locking up, he noticed a figure lingering by the parking lot. It was Derek, flanked by Jake and Evan. "Well, well," Derek said, sauntering forward with his usual swagger. "If it isn't the town's new hero." Mac remained calm, his keys dangling from his hand. "Something I can help you with?" "You've been busy," Derek said, his voice dripping with mockery. Talking to the wrong people, stirring up things you don't understand. Jake stepped closer, cracking his knuckles. Maybe we should teach you a little respect. Evan lingered behind them, his expression torn. His eyes met Mac's briefly before darting away. Mac shifted his stance, his voice steady. I don't want trouble, but I'm not walking away either. So, if you're here to make a point, get on with it. Derek sneered. You think you're untouchable? This is my town. Your town? Mac said, his tone cutting. Look around. People are starting to realize you're nothing but a bully hiding behind your father's name. Derek's face reddened, and he stepped closer, jabbing a finger at Mac's chest. You've got no idea who you're messing with. Mac's hand shot up, catching Derek's wrist mid-jab. His grip was firm but controlled. And you've got no idea what I've seen, kid, he said quietly. Walk away, now. Jake lunged, but Mac sidestepped, grabbing the younger man by the arm and twisting it behind his back. Jake yelped in pain as Mac shoved him away. Derek fumed, his bravado cracking. He glanced at Evan, who still hadn't moved. Do something, Derek barked. Evan hesitated, then shook his head. No. Derek's eyes widened in disbelief. What did you say? I said no, Evan repeated, stepping back. I'm done. Derek glared at him, then turned back to Mac. This isn't over, he spat before storming off, Jake limping behind him. Evan lingered, his shoulders slumping as the others disappeared. Mac approached him, his tone softer now. You all right? Evan nodded shakily. I couldn't do it anymore. I don't want to be like them. Mac placed a hand on Evan's shoulder. You made the right choice. Now it's time to start fixing things. That evening Mac sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The confrontation with Derek had escalated things, but Evan's defection felt like a turning point. He picked up his phone and dialed Eric. They're starting to crack, Mac said when Eric answered. Derek just lost one of his crew. That's good news, Eric replied. I've been digging into the council's financial records, and there's something there. If we can tie it back to Richard, it's game over. Let me know what you find, Mac said. Will do, Eric said. And Mac, be careful. If Derek's lashing out, his father might not be far behind. Mac hung up, his jaw tightening. He wasn't afraid of what was coming, but he knew the fight was far from over. The next morning, Clearwater buzzed with rumors about the confrontation between Mac and Derek at the community center. Whispers floated through the diner, the hardware store, and the schoolyard, growing louder with each retelling. Mac had become the town's quiet symbol of resistance, though he hardly felt like a hero. As he sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise, his phone rang. It was Eric. I found something, Eric said, his voice tinged with urgency. Richard Hastings has been funneling money through fake contracts on town projects. It's all tied to Derek's intimidation campaign. If we can get a few people to corroborate, this could be it. Who do you need? Mac asked, already running through a list of names. Anyone with first-hand knowledge, Eric replied. People who've seen the connections between Derek's actions and his father's deals. Mac thought for a moment. Linda and John have been vocal. They might know enough to help. And Evan, he's starting to talk. There was a pause on the line. Evan's the weak link, Eric said carefully. If Derek or his dad catch wind, they'll go after him hard. I'll keep him safe, Mac said firmly. When are you ready to meet? Tonight, Eric said. I'll bring everything I've got. That afternoon, Mac met with Linda and John at the community center. They were hesitant at first, glancing over their shoulders as if Derek might walk through the door at any moment. Are you sure about this? Linda asked, her voice low. If Richard's involved, this could get dangerous. More dangerous than living like this? Mac countered. You've already lost so much to them. This is our chance to take it back. John sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He's right, Linda. They've had their way with this town for years. If we don't push back now, they'll just keep tightening their grip. Linda nodded reluctantly. All right, I'll tell Eric what I know. That evening, Eric set up shop in Mac's kitchen, his laptop open and a folder of documents spread across the table. Linda, John, and Evan sat nearby, each looking more nervous than the last. All right, Eric began, adjusting his glasses. Here's what we've got so far. He laid out a series of documents, each detailing suspicious financial activity tied to Richard Hastings. Fake invoices, inflated project costs, and donations funneled into shell accounts painted a damning picture. Derek's harassment isn't random, Eric continued. It's a strategy. His crew scares off competition, forces sales, and clears the way for Richard's businesses to thrive. Linda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. That's exactly what he did to me. When I refused to sell, the harassment started. I didn't think it could be tied back to Richard directly, but this proves it. Evan fidgeted in his seat, avoiding everyone's gaze. Mac turned to him, his voice calm but firm. You've seen this up close, Evan. Can you confirm any of it? Evan hesitated, then nodded slowly. Derek used to brag about it. Said his dad had the cops and the council wrapped around his finger. They made us hit places his dad wanted to buy out, like Linda's shop. Eric's pen scratched across his notebook as he took notes. That's exactly what we need. If you're willing to testify. Evan's head snapped up, panic in his eyes. Testify? No way. If they find out… They won't, Mac interrupted. Not until it's too late. You've already taken the hardest step by walking away. This is just the next one. Evan swallowed hard, glancing at Linda and John. Their quiet resolve seemed to steady him, and he nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Eric exhaled, relief evident on his face. This is big. Between Evan's testimony and these records, we've got a real shot at exposing the Hastings family. But we need one more thing: public pressure. What do you mean? Linda asked. Once this story breaks, the town needs to back it, Eric explained. If people stay silent, Richard's lawyers will spin it as a personal vendetta, but if enough people come forward, they can't ignore it. Mac leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. We'll hold a meeting. Invite everyone who's been affected. If we can show the town that they're not alone, they'll stand up. The next day, Mac and Linda began spreading the word. They stopped by shops, knocked on doors, and spoke to anyone willing to listen. Slowly but surely, the stories began to pour in, stories of vandalism, intimidation, and lives uprooted by Derek and his father. By the evening of the meeting, the community center was packed. Mac stood at the front of the room, scanning the crowd. Linda and John sat near the stage, along with Evan, who looked pale but determined. Eric was off to the side, his notebook in hand, ready to document every word. When the murmurs quieted, Mac stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," he began, his deep voice cutting through the room. "I know this isn't easy. For years, this town has been living under the shadow of fear of Derek Hastings, his crew, and the power his family wields. But tonight, we take the first step in taking back our town." The crowd murmured in agreement, a few nodding their heads. "I've spoken to many of you," Mac continued. "I've heard your stories. You're not alone. Derek and his father have targeted us because they think we'll stay quiet. They're counting on our fear. But we don't have to be afraid anymore." Linda stood, her voice trembling but strong. "They took my business. They tried to run me and my son out of town. But thanks to Mac, I know we can fight back." One by one, others began to speak, sharing their experiences and adding to the growing momentum. By the time the meeting ended, there was a palpable sense of unity in the room. For the first time in years, Clearwater felt like a community again. As the crowd dispersed, Eric approached Mac, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've lit a fire under this town, Mac. They're ready to fight." Mac nodded, his jaw set with determination. Good, because the Hastings family isn't going down without one. The community meeting at the center was a turning point for Clearwater. The stories shared that night echoed through the town, giving people the courage to finally confront the Hastings family's reign of intimidation. But just as the resolve of the townsfolk began to solidify, Richard Hastings made his move. It started the very next morning. Flyers were plastered on shop windows, telephone poles, and even the front door of the community center. The bold, capitalized letters read, "Beware of outsiders stirring trouble in our town." Beneath the headline was a poorly disguised accusation against Mac, painting him as an agitator who had come to Clearwater to divide the community. Mac stood in front of the diner, one of the flyers clutched in his hand. He had seen this tactic before, a calculated attempt to deflect attention and sow doubt. Behind him, Sarah peeked out from behind the counter. "They were up before sunrise," she said. "I saw a couple of Derek's friends putting them up, but no one stopped them." "Of course they didn't," Mac muttered, crumpling the flyer. "This isn't about me. It's about scaring people into silence again." Sarah nodded, her face pale with worry. "And it might work. Some folks are already talking about pulling back." "Let them talk," Mac said, his voice firm. "They've started something bigger than this nonsense. Richard can't stop it now." The attacks escalated quickly. That afternoon, Linda called Mac in a panic. She had returned home to find the word "liar" spray-painted across her garage door. John's hardware store had its windows smashed during the night, and even the community center was not spared, its parking lot littered with broken glass and the remains of burned flyers. Mac visited each location, offering quiet reassurances to those affected, but as he stood outside Linda's home, his jaw clenched. He knew these acts were more than vandalism. They were calculated strikes meant to send a message. The Hastings family wasn't going down without a fight. When Mac returned home that evening, he found Evan sitting on his porch, visibly shaken. The boy's hands trembled as he gripped a soda can, his eyes darting nervously. "What happened?" Mac asked, sitting beside him. "Derek found out," Evan whispered. "About the meeting. About me." Mac's stomach tightened. "What did he say?" "He said I made the biggest mistake of my life," Evan replied, his voice cracking. "That I'm dead to him. He called me a traitor." Mac put a steadying hand on Evan's shoulder. "Listen to me, Evan. He's just trying to scare you. That's all he's ever done, scare people into doing what he wants. You don't have to listen to him anymore." Evan looked up. Desperation etched on his face. "What if he comes after me?" Mac's gaze was unwavering. "Then he'll have to deal with me first." The next day, Mac met with Eric at the diner. The journalist had been busy compiling his evidence into a story that was poised to break wide open, but even he couldn't ignore the tension building in town. "They're doubling down," Eric said, sipping his coffee. "Flyers, vandalism, threats. It's all classic damage control. They're trying to make this about you instead of them." "Let them try," Mac said. "The truth is on our side." Eric smirked, but his expression turned serious. "The problem is, they're not playing by the rules. I've heard Richard's already putting pressure on the council and the police to shut this down. If we don't act soon, they might bury it before it sees the light of day." Mac leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. "We act now. Tonight, we hit them with everything we've got. Your story, Evan's testimony, the financial records, get it all out there." Eric nodded. "It'll be in tomorrow's paper, but you'd better be ready for the fallout." "I've been ready," Mac said. That night, Eric worked late, finalizing the article that would expose Richard Hastings and his family's corruption. Meanwhile, Mac rallied the townsfolk again, urging them to stay the course despite the escalating threats. Linda and John spoke with renewed determination, their courage inspiring others who had wavered. The next morning, the town woke to a front-page headline that sent shockwaves through Clearwater. "The Hastings Family, a Legacy of Fear and Corruption." The article detailed everything: Derek's campaign of intimidation, Richard's financial schemes, and the complicity of key town officials. Evan's testimony was included, though Eric had carefully protected his identity. The response was immediate. Business owners began calling for investigations. Residents demanded answers at the town hall, and even some of the council members started distancing themselves from the Hastings name. But Richard wasn't done yet. That evening, as Max stepped out onto his porch, he spotted headlights approaching his house. A familiar black SUV screeched to a halt in his driveway, and Derek, Jake, and a third man spilled out, their faces twisted with rage. "You think you can ruin us?" Derek shouted, storming toward Mac. "You think you can humiliate my family and get away with it?" Mac stayed calm, stepping off the porch to meet them. "You humiliated yourselves, Derek. You just can't handle the truth coming out." Jake cracked his knuckles, his movements tense and aggressive. "You're gonna pay for this, old man." Mac's eyes flicked to the third man, one of Derek's newer recruits, unsure but following orders. Mac addressed him directly. "You don't have to be part of this. Walk away." The recruit hesitated, but Derek barked, "Don't listen to him. He's bluffing." Mac sighed, his patience wearing thin. "If you're here to fight, get on with it, but you'll regret it." Derek lunged first, his fists flying in wild, uncoordinated arcs. Mac sidestepped easily, grabbing Derek's arm and twisting it behind his back. Jake charged next, but Mac ducked his swing and delivered a controlled shove that sent him sprawling into the dirt. The third man froze, clearly out of his depth. He dropped his fists and took a step back. "I'm out," he muttered, before running toward the SUV. Derek squirmed in Mac's grip, shouting curses. "You're dead, Dixon! You hear me? Dead!" Mac released him with a shove, his voice calm but firm. "Go home, Derek. This is over." Derek scrambled to his feet, his bravado crumbling as he retreated to the SUV. "This isn't over," he spat, before climbing in and speeding away. Mac stood in the quiet that followed, his fists clenched at his sides. The fight was over for now, but he knew the battle was far from finished. The morning after the confrontation in his driveway, Mac found himself back at the diner. The small-town buzz had shifted dramatically since Eric's article hit the newsstands. Conversations crackled with anger, disbelief, and a long-overdue sense of empowerment. "Have you read it?" Sarah asked, sliding Mac a cup of coffee as she gestured toward the paper on the counter. The bold headline still dominated the front page. "The Hastings Family, a Legacy of Fear and Corruption." "I have," Mac said simply, though the weight of the article lingered in his mind. Eric had delivered a damning exposé, laying bare the financial manipulation and coordinated harassment that had propped up the Hastings family for years. "It's working," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "People are talking. They're mad, Mac. Really mad." "Good," Mac replied. "They should be." That afternoon, Mac stopped by Linda's house. She had spent the morning repainting her garage door, covering the hateful graffiti left behind by Derek's crew. Kevin was helping, the boy's brushstrokes confident as he worked beside his mother. Linda turned when she saw Mac approach, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Heard about last night," she said. "Derek just doesn't know when to quit, does he?" "No," Mac said, "but he's cracking. You can see it. The more we stand up, the more desperate he gets." Linda nodded, stepping closer. "A few of the other parents are starting to come forward, telling their stories. I think your meeting lit a fire under this town." "Not just the meeting," Mac said. "It's people like you who are making this happen. You're the ones who've lived through it. Your voices matter more than mine." Linda smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you gave us the push we needed." By evening, the town square was alive with activity. Residents gathered in clusters, discussing the revelations in Eric's article. John, the hardware store owner, had called for an impromptu meeting to address the fallout. Mac arrived early, standing off to the side as people filed into the small, makeshift assembly near the gazebo. Eric was already there, his notebook in hand. He looked up when Mac approached, his expression a mix of excitement and caution. "You've made waves, Mac," Eric said. "People are coming out of the woodwork now. The council's even called an emergency session to deal with the backlash." "They'll try to spin it," Mac said. "You know that." "Yeah," Eric admitted. "But public opinion's shifting. They're running out of places to hide." The meeting began with John stepping forward, his usually timid voice carrying strength. "For years, we've all been scared to speak out," he said. "But now we know we're not alone. It's time to hold the Hastings family accountable." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and one by one, residents stood to share their experiences. A single mother recounted how Derek's crew had trashed her car after she refused to sell her house. A shopkeeper described months of harassment that had driven customers away. Each story added to the growing tide of outrage, the collective voice of a community reclaiming its strength. When the murmurs quieted, Mac stepped forward. He scanned the crowd, seeing faces filled with determination and hope. "This isn't just about Derek or Richard," Mac said, his deep voice cutting through the night air. "It's about all of us. For too long we've let fear dictate our lives. But look around you. We're stronger than they are. Together we can take this town back." The applause was thunderous, echoing through the square. As the meeting ended and the crowd began to disperse, a figure approached Mac from the shadows. It was Detective Robert Collins, his face serious as he motioned for Mac to step aside. "We need to talk," Collins said, his voice low. Mac followed him to a quieter spot near the gazebo. "What's going on?" "The article shook things up," Collins said. "We've got enough evidence now to move on Richard. The DA's signed off on a warrant for his arrest, and we're planning a raid on his offices tomorrow." "That's good news," Mac said, though he caught the hesitation in Collins's tone. "What's the problem?" Collins sighed, his hand brushing over his buzzed hair. "Richard's not going to go quietly. He's already lawyered up, and I'm hearing whispers that he's planning to retaliate. You need to be ready." "I've been ready," Mac said firmly. Collins nodded. "Figured you'd say that. Just keep an eye on Evan. Derek's still a wild card, and I wouldn't put it past him to lash out." The next morning, the raid on Richard Hastings' office unfolded like a scene from a movie. Patrol cars surrounded the building as officers moved in, armed with warrants and evidence compiled by Eric and the DA. Mac watched from a distance, standing with Eric and Linda as the scene unfolded. Richard emerged in handcuffs, his once proud demeanor replaced by barely concealed fury. Reporters swarmed him, shouting questions about the allegations of corruption and his role in Derek's harassment campaigns. "This is a witch hunt," Richard shouted, his voice sharp with indignation. "These charges are baseless, and I will clear my name." But the damage was done. The town's most untouchable man was finally being held to account, and the cracks in his empire were impossible to ignore. As Richard was led into a waiting patrol car, Derek appeared in the crowd, his face pale and drawn. He tried to push past the reporters, but an officer stopped him. "You can't do this," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do you know who we are?" Mac stepped forward then, his gaze locking with Derek's. "We know exactly who you are," he said calmly. Derek glared at him, his bravado crumbling as the weight of the situation settled over him. "This isn't over," he spat before turning and disappearing into the crowd. That evening, Mac sat on his porch, the town quieter than it had been in weeks. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were winning. Evan arrived, his face lighter than Mac had ever seen it. "It's happening, isn't it?" he asked, sitting beside Mac. "It is," Mac replied, "but there's still work to do." Evan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks for not giving up on me." Mac glanced at him, his voice steady. "We don't leave anyone behind. You're part of this town now, Evan. That means something." As the stars began to appear in the sky, Mac felt a quiet sense of hope. Clearwater was changing, and for the first time, it felt like a place worth staying in. The morning air in Clearwater felt different. It was heavier, charged with the knowledge that the Hastings family was finally being held accountable. Richard Hastings was in custody, and the town had erupted with stories that had long been silenced. Yet, Mac knew the fight wasn't over. Derek, emboldened by desperation and humiliation, wasn't done. Mac stood in the center of his yard, rolling his shoulders as he surveyed the quiet street. His instincts told him to stay vigilant. Desperate men were the most dangerous, and Derek's grip on his perceived power was slipping fast. Evan showed up just before noon, looking more confident than he had days ago. His testimony in Eric's article had been carefully anonymized, but it was enough to tip the scales. The boy carried a renewed sense of purpose. "Hey, Mac," Evan said, setting his bike against the porch. "I heard about Richard. They say he could go to prison for years." "If the DA does their job, he will," Mac replied, his voice steady. "But Derek's still out there, and he's not going to take this lying down." Evan's expression faltered, but he nodded. "What do we do?" "We stay ready," Mac said. The town remained on edge as the day stretched into evening. Mac spent the afternoon at the community center, training Kevin and checking in with Linda. The meeting from 2 nights ago had solidified the community's resolve, but the recent vandalism still lingered in everyone's minds. As the sun set, Mac locked up the center and stepped into the parking lot, the cool air prickling at his skin. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the silence felt unnaturally heavy. It was then that he heard the rumble of an engine, followed by the screech of tires. A black SUV roared into the parking lot, headlights glaring like twin eyes fixed on him. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and Derek stepped out, flanked by Jake and another young man Mac didn't recognize. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Derek called, his voice laced with venom. Mac stayed where he was, his stance relaxed, but alert. "You looking for another lesson, Derek?" Derek's face twisted with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you've won? You don't get it, do you? This is my town. My family built this place." "Your family built a house of cards," Mac said calmly, "and now it's falling." Jake stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see how tough you are now, Dixon." Mac shifted his weight, his voice steady. "Walk away, Jake. You've already lost." Jake hesitated, glancing at Derek, who barked, "Don't just stand there! Do something!" With a frustrated growl, Jake lunged. Mac moved with precision, stepping aside and grabbing Jake's wrist mid-swing. Using Jake's momentum, Mac twisted, sending him sprawling to the ground with a loud thud. Derek shouted in frustration and charged next, his movements wild and uncoordinated. Mac sidestepped the attack, catching Derek by the arm and forcing him off balance. Derek stumbled, crashing into the side of his SUV. The third young man hesitated, his eyes darting between Mac and Derek. Mac fixed him with a calm but firm gaze. "You don't want this," he said. "Walk away while you can." The recruit took a step back, then another, before bolting into the night without a word. "Coward!" Derek shouted after him before turning back to Mac, his face red with fury. "This isn't over." "It is," Mac said, his voice steady and final. "It's over because the people in this town aren't afraid of you anymore. You've got nothing left, Derek." Derek lunged again, but his movements were sloppy, fueled by rage rather than skill. Mac dodged easily, delivering a controlled shove that sent Derek sprawling to the pavement. As Derek lay on the ground, gasping for breath, Mac stood over him. "It's time for you to grow up," Mac said, his tone calm but firm. "Because this town isn't yours. It never was." The police arrived minutes later, lights flashing as they pulled into the parking lot. Detective Collins stepped out, his expression a mix of frustration and relief. "What's going on here, Dixon?" Collins asked. Derek decided he didn't like losing. Mac replied simply, motioning toward the young man still on the ground. Collins sighed, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Derek Hastings, you're under arrest for assault and intimidation. Again. Derek groaned as he was hauled to his feet, his bravado completely drained. As the officers loaded him into the patrol car, Derek glared at Mac one last time. You'll regret this, Dixon. Mac met his gaze, unflinching. Not as much as you will. The next day, Clearwater was alive with renewed energy. News of Derek's arrest spread quickly, solidifying the town's resolve to stand against the Hastings family once and for all. Eric stopped by Mac's house, a broad grin on his face. Derek's facing charges for this latest stunt, he said, and the DA's piling it on top of everything else. Richard's lawyers are scrambling to keep up. It's a good start, Mac said, though his tone was cautious. But it's not over until the whole system that propped them up is gone. Eric nodded. Agreed. But for now, you've given this town something it hasn't had in a long time. Hope. Mac glanced toward the street, where neighbors were beginning to gather, their faces lighter than he'd seen before. It was true, Clearwater was changing, and the people were finally finding their voices. That evening, Mac sat on his porch, the quiet settling over the town like a long overdue peace. Linda and Kevin stopped by, bringing homemade pie as a thank you for everything Mac had done. You're staying, right? Kevin asked, his eyes wide with hope. Mac looked at him, then at Linda, and nodded. Yeah, I think I will. As the stars appeared in the sky, Mac felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. The fight had been hard, but it was worth it. Clearwater was worth it. The sun rose over Clearwater, casting golden light over the small town that was finally beginning to heal. The scars left by Derek and Richard Hastings ran deep, but the cracks in the community's foundation were being mended by a newfound unity. For the first time in years, the townspeople walked their streets without fear, their voices growing louder and stronger. Mac stood on the porch, the morning breeze carrying the distant hum of life in the town square. A week had passed since Derek's arrest, and Richard's charges had been formalized. The Hastings name, once synonymous with power, now carried a weight of shame. A knock at the door pulled Mac from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Linda and Kevin standing on the steps, each holding small bouquets of flowers. We're heading to the square for the memorial, Linda said, her voice soft. Memorial? Mac asked, stepping outside. For all the families and businesses, the Hastings hurt, Kevin explained, his tone more serious than Mac had ever heard. It's to remind everyone of what we've overcome. Mac nodded. I'll come with you. The town square was bustling by the time they arrived. A small stage had been set up near the gazebo, draped with a banner that read, Clearwater Strong. Tables lined the perimeter, showcasing photos of families and businesses that had been affected by the Hastings' reign of intimidation. Mac spotted familiar faces in the crowd, John from the hardware store, Sarah from the diner, and even Detective Collins, who stood off to the side with his arms crossed, a rare smile on his face. Eric approached, a camera slung over his shoulder. Glad you made it, he said, offering Mac a handshake. This is for everyone who stayed strong, for everyone who didn't give up. Mac glanced around at the crowd, seeing the faces of those who had once been silenced by fear. Now, they stood tall, their voices united. As the ceremony began, Linda took the stage, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Today, we honor the courage of this town, she said. For years we lived under the shadow of fear, but we didn't let it break us. Thanks to each of you, your stories, your strength, we've taken our town back. The crowd erupted in applause, but Linda wasn't finished. And there's one person we owe a special thanks to, she continued, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Mac. Mac Dixon. You came here as a stranger, but you gave us something we'd almost forgotten how to find. Hope. The applause swelled, and Mac felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. He nodded in acknowledgement, the warmth of their gratitude settling over him like a comforting blanket. After the ceremony, Mac wandered through the square, stopping to speak with the townsfolk. Each conversation reinforced what he had come to realize. Clearwater was no longer the fractured, fearful place it had been when he arrived. As he passed one of the photo tables, Evan caught up with him, his hands tucked nervously into his jacket pockets. "Hey, Mac," Evan said, his voice softer than usual. Mac turned to him. "What's on your mind, Evan?" I wanted to say thanks," Evan said, his gaze dropping to the ground, "for giving me a chance to make things right." Mac clapped a hand on Evan's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You earned it. You made the hard choice, and that takes guts. Don't forget that." Evan smiled faintly, a spark of confidence flickering in his eyes. "I won't." As the day wound down, Mac returned home, the quiet of his yard a welcome contrast to the buzz of the square. He settled into his porch chair, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Linda arrived shortly after, carrying a plate of leftover pie. She set it on the table beside him and sat down with a contented sigh. "I think we might actually be okay," she said, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. Mac nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You will be? This town's stronger than it realizes." Linda glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "And what about you? Are you staying?" Mac hesitated, the question settling over him like the dusk. When he had first come to Clearwater, he had planned to keep to himself, to start over quietly. But now, the thought of leaving felt wrong. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think I'll stick around." Linda smiled, a genuine warmth lighting her face. "Good. This town needs people like you." Mac chuckled softly. "I think this town's doing just fine on its own now." As the stars emerged in the night sky, Mac sat in the quiet of his porch, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Clearwater had faced its demons and come out stronger on the other side. And so, had he thought of the people he had come to know, Linda and Kevin, Evan, Eric, and all the others who had found their voices. They had shown him that even in the face of fear and adversity, kindness, resilience, and community could prevail. For the first time in years, Mac felt at peace. Clearwater wasn't just a town anymore. It was home. As the story of Mac Dixon and the resilient town of Clearwater ends, we are reminded of the power of courage, kindness, and community. No matter the challenges we face, standing together and supporting one another can help us overcome even the darkest times. If you enjoyed this story of perseverance and hope, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring narratives that highlight the strength of the human spirit. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to let us know what you thought about Mac's journey. Together, let's keep spreading messages of resilience, kindness, and hope. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.